Hi everyone, this is once again Jewish history class at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. Today we want to talk about early Zionism, really kind of from the mid-19th century up to the end of World War II. And this is a key chapter in Jewish history, obviously. This leads up to the establishment of the State of Israel and the Israeli War of Independence. There's a lot that happens over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that is of note here. And really, this subject demands its own course. And who knows? Maybe at some future point, someone at Flagler College, me or someone else, will end up teaching a course on this. But for now, this will have to suffice. Zionism is really just another word for Jewish nationalism. In fact, I remember taking a course in graduate school on this topic, and the professor wrote the word Zionism on the board and asked us to define it, and we went through conversations, and after, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes of discussing this, of coming up with various notions of what that meant, he simply wrote the words Jewish nationalism underneath that. And so we have to read this as against the background of broader nationalism here, and recognize that Zionism, even though there had always been, among many Jewish communities at least, a desire to return to the Holy Land, to return to the site of the ancient kingdom of Israel, that was more of an ideal and often something that people believed would happen when the Messiah came. But with the rise of nationalism as a social and cultural force in the modern period, Zionism received new life and really, in many ways, a new definition. Right? It became much more of a secular thing, despite the involvement of highly religious Jews throughout the period or throughout the history of Zionism. And we'll have more to say about that, I think, when we talk about the State of Israel. The 19th century sees the establishment of a number of nations, people who had not been previously part of a nation, like the Germans and the Italians. These had been conglomerations or confederations of smaller states. They joined together to form these large nations. This enables them to accomplish things they were not able to accomplish before this, to express their agency in new ways. Sorry for the yawn there, to thrive in ways that they hadn't been able to do as divided peoples, so to speak. And this lesson was not lost on the Jews of either Western or Eastern Europe, or those who lived under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire, for that matter. Especially with the establishment of a number of nations in the Balkan Peninsula, though. This was something closer to the largest Jewish communities. The late 19th century sees a number of nations break off from, what had been either the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The country of Serbia, for instance, is a good example of this. And these become nations. They become their own sovereign states. And this in areas where Jews were paying attention, right, in Eastern Europe. And so this provides an impetus for many Jews to start thinking about establishing their own nation, or having their own nation where they can have self-determinacy and things like that. The Ottoman Empire, moreover, in the 19th century was in severe decline. It was known by many as the sick man of Europe. The decline was so severe, in fact, that the British and the French in particular began to kind of prop up the Ottomans as a hedge against Russian expansion. Something, of course, that came back to bite them in the First World War when the Ottomans joined with the Germans and the Austrians. But the Ottoman Empire was in severe decline, and this left open the possibility that the lands governed by the Ottoman Empire could be carved up and form smaller nations. Of course, one of those lands was Palestine, and many Jews began to sort of hope for this or plan for this, or even in many cases to immigrate to Palestine, hoping to settle there and to have a homeland for the Jewish people. The other thing we should say about the Ottoman Empire is this is the last of the great land-based empires. It's really a relic of a previous period. And with its decline, there was a sense that a new world was coming into being, even in the Middle East. And so, this movement towards Zionism is part of that. There had been a fair amount of pre-Zionist Jewish migration to Palestine. We can go back to some examples that we have cited previously in this course. Figures like Maimonides and Nachmanides fleeing from persecution in the Iberian Peninsula, tried to make their way toward Palestine, both of them actually. Maimonides ended up spending, sorry for all the yawns, I don't know, I don't feel particularly tired, I just seem to be yawning a lot here. Okay, anyway. But figures like that had expressed an intent to immigrate to Palestine, to go and die in the Jewish homeland, so to speak. But this had often been, highly religious Jews, often elderly Jews who had means, who went there to die more than to live. And that's kind of a stereotype, but it's all stereotypes, I suppose, have some basis in reality, or at least in perception, and that was certainly the case for many. And you think about even Tevye, our literary character, and that's more recent, even after Zionism. But Tevye has a desire, and he's encouraged by his rich son-in-law to move to Palestine, because that's what old Jews do. Once they have lived their lives and had their career, they go off to the Holy Land to die and maybe to wait for the Messiah there, right? So that's pre-Zionist Jewish migration to Palestine was not with any great intent or systematic or anything. It was more piecemeal, and sometimes even temporary. But in the 19th century, there were a number of Jewish intellectuals who began to write about returning to Israel, and reclaiming the Jewish homeland, reclaiming Jewish autonomy, having their own place. And this is part and parcel of kind of nationalist conversations in general. But a lot of this is, accompanying the rise in anti-Semitism in the 19th century, especially in Eastern Europe. One example, this is from Leon Pinsker's Auto-Emancipation, written in 1882. Leon Pinsker was a Russian Jew, intellectual, a maskil, an enlightened Jew, so to speak. But he goes through, right? He says, the hoary problem subsumed under the Jewish question today, as ever in the past, provokes discussion. We have to solve, and that is, if the Jews are hated, then what are their options, right? I'm kind of paraphrasing here, okay? With other peoples, they can have self-determinacy in their own homeland, so to speak, but it is different with the people of Israel. There is no such equality in the nation's dealings with the Jews. The basis is absent upon which treaties and international law may be applied, mutual respect, right? The Jews are not accorded any kind of respect. Only when this basis is established, and the only way that's going to happen, of course, is if the Jews have their own homeland. When the equality of Jews with other nations becomes a fact, can the Jewish problem be considered solved? Now, this is not to confuse the term Jewish problem with the way that the Nazis eventually used this, by the way. The Jewish problem for Leon Pinsker was that we have tried to assimilate, and we have failed largely to assimilate. And people do not treat us equally. They don't give us the respect. We can't become members of the nations in which we live, because we are not given that kind of respect. So we need our own homeland. We need our own nation. And he continues to go through this. He talks about what he calls Judeophobia, what is really another word for anti-Semitism. That this is just stands in the way of us advancing everywhere. And some of this is religious. Jews are said to have crucified Jesus, to have drunk the blood of Christians, to have poisoned wells, to have taken usury, to have exploited the peasant, and so on. These and 1,001 other charges against an entire people have been proved groundless, but Jew baiters, as he calls them, continue to bring these things up, and Jews are suffering as a result of this, right? And so we need our own. The long and short of it is we need our own nation. in order to escape from all of this and have our own agency, our own self-determinacy, and our own autonomy. The idea of Zionism receives a real boost, especially in Eastern Europe with the 1881 pogroms. Now let's remember that a lot of Jews in Western Europe at this point were still pretty optimistic about their ability to assimilate. This is pre-Dreyfus Affair, even though there was a rise in anti-Semitism and racism was beginning to rear its ugly head. There was a good deal of optimism that this could happen. In Russia, on the other hand, things began to get really bad in the 1880s with the 1881 pogroms. In Russia, in Eastern Europe, we see the formation of movements, even organizations. Okay, these are often captured under the term Hibatzion, which means something like love of Zion. Okay, but some groups under the broader Hibatzion movement even begin to immigrate in fairly small numbers to Palestine. This is what touches off what's called the first Aliyah, and I'll talk about the term in just a minute here. But the worsening condition of Jews in Eastern Europe kicks this into a gear, not a high gear yet necessarily, but it goes from a trickle to a steady flow of immigrants going to Palestine. In Western Europe, where ideas of nationalism are much better formed, let's remember that Russia still is very much a feudal society at this point. There's still serfs. There is no real sense of equality, or that there needs to be equality, except maybe only for the most idealistic intellectuals who have received their training in Western Europe. If you read the works of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or some other great Russian novelist during this time, you can see that these ideas are really just in formulation, and they're spreading there from Western Europe, but there are a lot of there's a lot of opposition to that. In Western Europe, on the other hand, these things were now taken for granted. And it's there that, partly because those things are taken for granted and the Jews are still not realizing that we see Zionism not just as a kind of idea that is rather diffuse, but instead achieves a kind of organizational quality. And the catalyst behind this, the so-called father of Zionism, and the one who was even called the father of the state of Israel, is Theodor Herzl, or Theodor Herzl, actually, is a better pronunciation of that. Herzl was a Hungarian. He's born in Budapest. There's a marker at the Dohányi Street Synagogue in Budapest of his birthplace, kind of commemorating that. But Herzl went off to receive an education. Well, his family moved to Vienna. He became a journalist and spent, starting in the late 1880s, early 1890s, was sent as a correspondent for a Viennese newspaper to Paris. And he ended up covering the Dreyfus Affair. And it was this, seeing the kind of frenzy that the French people were whipped up into as a result of this, the anti-Semitism that became apparent to him, and the kind of international scandal nature of the Dreyfus Affair, Herzl became convinced that assimilation was simply not possible, and embraced the idea that the Jews needed their own homeland. And Herzl was a skilled writer. In the mid-1890s, he wrote a couple of literary works about Zionism. One of these was a novel, and the other was more of a kind of manifesto arguing for Zionism. But these became popular reading in Jewish communities all over Europe. And with this voice as a kind of spokesperson for Zionism, Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in 1897. This met in the Swiss city of Basel, and this would evolve eventually into the World Zionist Organization. Now, Herzl was looking at different plans. Obviously, Palestine was the traditional Jewish homeland, but Herzl was convinced that Jews needed a homeland of any kind. For a time, he approached the British government and floated a plan with them to create Uganda, which at the time was, I believe, a British protectorate in Central Africa, the Great Lakes region of Africa, to convert Uganda into a homeland for the Jews. And even entered into some negotiation with them. This does demonstrate, and Scheinlein points this out in the textbook, how removed Herzl was from the Hibatzion movement. I mean, these people were insisting, that Palestine was the only place for the Jews. He was just interested in any place, any homeland for the Jews. And Uganda, was fine. And I think in his mind, nobody else wants Uganda. Of course, he's not acknowledging that there were millions of people living in Uganda at the time. This is one of the most densely populated regions of Africa. But the British went to the table, so to speak, with him, and but the negotiations fell apart. And Herzl, listening to the outcry over this Uganda plan from among the Jewish communities, especially in Eastern Europe, realized that the only option was Palestine. And so that was a short-lived experience, so to speak. In the meantime, there were Jews moving to Palestine. The first Aliyah runs roughly between 1880 and the first couple of years of the 20th century. 1903, I think, is kind of the end marker of the first Aliyah. The word Aliyah itself means ascent in Hebrew, or going up, and it was the term that was used to describe the actual immigration to Palestine. The first Aliyah was accomplished, and this is it's a steady flow, but it's still a fairly small steady flow, right? There aren't huge numbers of Jews moving there. There was a group called Belu, who was the kind of main body of Jews who move over that 20 or so year period to Palestine. And they set up these agricultural colonies, really kind of on the model, the socialist model of the kinds of things that are being floated by socialists in Eastern Europe at this point. But none of these are very large, and they're rather haphazard in their execution, and most of them would have fallen apart. In fact, many Jews moved to Palestine and realized this isn't working, and some of them go back to Russia or back to Poland. The only thing that keeps this movement going is the support and the financial backing of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Of course, a scion of the great Rothschild family. He is pushing this and supporting it financially. But the first Aliyah is, this is not yet truly systematic and with great intent. It does take thousands of Jews to Palestine, where they begin to set up settlements there, but these are not terribly successful at this point. However, one of the things that begins to happen, and this is not entirely happening in Palestine, it's partly running its course in Russia as well, is the revival of Hebrew, not just as a religious language, or even, as it happened with the Jewish Enlightenment, as a modern literary language, but even as a spoken language. And this is really kind of an incredible phenomenon. Hebrew is, I believe, the only language that was considered dead in terms of the fact that nobody spoke the language, to be revived as a spoken language, I think, in world history. Okay, sorry, I had to pause the recording there for a second because I'm cooped up with my children during this coronavirus epidemic, and one of them had just gotten hurt. So anyway, we're talking about the revival of Hebrew. The main driving force here was a fellow named Eliezer ben Yehuda, Born in Russia, he moved to Palestine, and he was a scholar of Hebrew. Um, and he made the decision that he was not going to speak any other language but Hebrew in his own family. Okay, so he and his wife took up the speaking of Hebrew, and they began to teach this as a spoken language to other people. Ben Yehuda also began to work on a Hebrew lexicon, right, and dictionaries and things like this. And his work really is what pushed this as a spoken language. And he founded an organization called the Hebrew Language Committee, and founded a school called the Hebrew Language Academy. And he's the one who, well, he determined a number of things about the language. He went with the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew, for instance, even though he was from Eastern Europe. And so one word, for instance, that is different in pronunciation is the word for Sabbath, or Shabbat. That the tav at the end of that is pronounced with a t sound instead of an s sound. In the Ashkenazic pronunciation to be Shabbos, but the modern Hebrew follows the Sephardic pronunciation. So anyway, that's just a piece of Hebrew that I learned at one point. Might as well share with you. But through the work of Eliezer ben Yehuda and those who attended his academies, these settler communities began to use this as a spoken language. And in fact, it served a really useful purpose, because most Jews knew some Hebrew and they could quickly adapt their Hebrew knowledge to spoken Hebrew. And especially if they attend some school where this is the language. And so Jews moving there who may have spoken different languages, some of them spoke Polish, some spoke German, some spoke Russian, they could communicate with each other in Hebrew. And so Hebrew, modern Hebrew in this case, became a kind of settler lingua franca. That is a common language that everyone learns so they can talk to each other, even if they have different languages they speak at home. And modern Hebrew is a marvel in that respect. Like I said, this is a unique cultural phenomenon, a unique cultural accomplishment for the Zionists. For whatever reason, this is not advancing. Okay, sorry, I had technical difficulties there. I had to pause the recording again. Let's see, can we get it to go? There we go. Now, the second Aliyah is in the first couple of decades, really kind of previous to World War I. And this is mostly Russian migrants, many of them informed by socialism. Many of them, in fact, had been part of socialist organizations. But it's, the Kishinev pogrom in Russia in 1903 and the aborted revolution of 1905. All of that convinces Jews that living in Russia is no longer bearable, and so many of them who had, like I said, joined these socialist organizations or was part of the Jewish Bund, they make their way to Palestine, informed by these socialist ideas. They do not. This group is not moving there primarily for religious reasons. They are moving there for nationalist reasons, and they have in their minds these socialist programs. Things like collective farms, right? And they are the ones who, and this is now a fairly large number of Jews moving to Palestine. They are the ones who begin to form these settlements that are called variously kibbutzim, or kibbutz as the singular, or moshavim, moshav, the singular there. A kibbutz. And in the upper right corner of the slide here, you can see a kibbutz. If you could go a little bit off the slide here, you would see the very edge of the Sea of Galilee. So this is in northern Israel. I forget the exact name of this one. I know it's got an aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew. It's something aleph. Anyway, starts with a D or a dalet. Anyway, The name's not relevant, I suppose. But you can see how the kibbutzes tend to be formed. We have these large dormitories where all of the residents would live collectively. They would have collective kitchens, collective bathrooms. So they don't have their own houses and their own settlements, even their own or their own farmland. All of the farmland then surrounds this. You can see they've got orchards and vineyards, and then what look like cereal crops and things like that. Maybe vegetable gardens over here. I don't know if this is corn. But this is all collective farming, right? So that we don't see individual plots on a kibbutz. All of the land belongs to all of the community, and everyone goes out and works it collectively. This is a kind of socialist utopia, in a sense. And these sorts of collective farms were being attempted elsewhere. Eventually, these are going to be tried, after the Bolshevik Revolution under Stalin. But already in the first couple decades of the 20th century, these kibbutzim are being formed in Palestine by these socialist Russian Jewish migrants there. A moshav is similar, except that families do have their own plots. However, there's cooperative farming, and so there are tools and plows and things shared by the community, and everyone helps each other on the land, but the plots themselves are individually owned or owned by families. The leadership of the second Aliyah comes to form a political party called the Mapai Party. This is where we see the emergence of figures like David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, and others who would take the reins of leadership after Israeli independence in 1948. Ben-Gurion, of course, was the first prime minister. The Mapai Party would eventually evolve into the Labor Party, which is still a force in Israeli politics, though it's been out of power now for a couple of decades. But this is largely, again, along socialist lines. Socialist ideas are informing this. In 1909, they found a city there, which they call Tel Aviv. It's near Jaffa, and it's just west of Jerusalem. And this is to be, this was a kind of socialist experiment as well, but in an urban space. Tel Aviv would eventually become their great metropolis, right? And it remains so all the way to the present. With the second Aliyah, with a large number of Jews now moving to Palestine, Arab opposition begins in earnest. And a lot of this is just the locals don't like the large number of Jews who are making it there. Especially after there's a revolution in Turkey in 1908, and Arab nationalism kicks into high gear at that point. The Arab nationalists who are looking for a Palestinian nation or some larger Arab nation begin to see the Jews as a threat, and already there's kind of violence and protests and things against Jewish settlement there. That's going to become obviously much more acute later on. Now, World War I, the Ottomans join with the Germans and the Austrians against the Allied powers, the British, the French, the Russians, and the Jews, being largely European in origin, and moreover either Russian or Western European, they tend to favor. Obviously not the Ottomans, given that the Ottomans stood in the way of them achieving what they wanted to, which was a Jewish nation there. They allied themselves with the British in particular, who were the primary Allied power fighting against the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans respond by arresting and otherwise harassing Jewish settlers in fairly large numbers there. The Jews go to work gathering intelligence for the British, and the British general Edmund Allenby ends up taking control of much of Palestine, defeating the Ottoman armies, And the Jews saw Allenby as a great liberator. There's still Allenby. Allenby is a name you still see in Israel today. There is, for instance, there's a bridge across the Jordan River that is the kind of border point between, well, it's actually between the West Bank and Jordan, but that's called the Allenby Bridge because Allenby crossed the Jordan around that point, I guess. The picture up at the top left here is of Edmund Allenby marching into Jerusalem. As the story goes, he got out of his car and decided to walk into Jerusalem out of respect for the holy city, because he was a Christian, and Jerusalem is sacred to him as well. So you can see people lined up on the streets as Allenby and his staff march into the city. Now this agreement, so to speak, between the British and the Jews leads eventually to the British offering promises to the Jews. But the interesting thing about this is the Jews are not the only ones who are getting kind of promises offered them by the British. The British made a real effort to appeal to the Arabs as well, right? Let's realize, and maybe this isn't totally apparent, that the Ottoman Empire was not an Arab empire. The Turks and the Arabs are different peoples, and the Arabs saw the Turks, even though they're both Muslim, and oftentimes saw the Turks as interlopers, as occupiers of their territory. And so there's especially after the Turkish Revolution in 1908, there's a fair amount of Arab nationalism happening. With T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, as he's otherwise known, right, as their broker, the British offer a prominent family in the Arabian Peninsula, the Hashemites, and the name itself is quite auspicious. They claim descent from the Hashimi clan of Mecca, which is the clan of Muhammad. And anyway, the name is certainly means something. But Hussein Hashim, the head of this powerful family, agrees with the British to aid them in the First World War against the Ottomans in exchange for the creation of a Hashemite kingdom, with Hussein himself as the ruler of that kingdom in the Levant, right? And so that would include Palestine. However, the British are also kind of offering, they're brokering with the Jews who are living there as well. The Jews form a legion, a military legion, and go to war on the British side. And in Britain itself, there is a figure named Chaim Weizmann. Next to Theodor Herzl, who I already talked about, arguably Weizmann is the most prominent Zionist in Western Europe in the early 20th century. He is pictured here in this roundel here. That's Weizmann. And he eventually becomes a political figure in independent Israel. I think he's a president of Israel at some point, I believe. Anyway, Weizmann, he also eventually becomes the president of the World Zionist Organization after Herzl dies. But Weizmann was born in Russia, but he was educated in Germany, became a professor at the University of Geneva. And but from there, he moved to Britain and became a professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester. He was quite a successful chemist. He worked on using bacterial cultures to make things, including the synthesizing of acetone, which was an essential substance used for military and other things, right? And so Weizmann was already in the kind of good graces of the British government, given his contributions as a chemist, and so he's brokering some of these deals, and it's with Weizmann kind of dealing with British government officials that they make the decision to the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Arthur James Balfour, issues a declaration in 1917 called the famous Balfour Declaration. I want to take a look at the text of that quickly here. It's brief, right? And so he's writing here to Lord Rothschild. I forget which Rothschild this is. It might be Edmund, but I think Edmund's dead by this point. Anyway, but this is, in a sense, an official declaration of the British government, given that Balfour was the Foreign Secretary. He says, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That's the operative phrase there, right? And will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. But the part that sticks in people's minds is His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This is the first time, and it's not a trivial thing, given that Britain was the world power at the time. The first time that a government had expressed a commitment to making a Jewish nation happen. And not just any Jewish nation, but a Jewish nation in Palestine, right? The Balfour Declaration, of course, is met with great acclaim by Jews worldwide, especially those in Palestine, but those who look upon Zionism favorably are fully in support of this, rejoicing in the streets, so to speak. The Arabs, on the other hand, are, well, pretty angry about this, right? And so in the aftermath of the First World War, with the creation of the League of Nations, now, if you have some knowledge of this, this will all make sense. If you don't, I don't, I mean, there's a bit of background that we would need here, but suffice it to say that the League of Nations, which is formed in the aftermath of the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles, this is, of course, a forerunner of the United Nations, but the United States votes not to be part of it, and it really doesn't have a lot of teeth. But one of the things the League of Nations does is it bestows upon the European colonial powers these things called mandates, which is, in essence, an international permission to continue to operate as a colonial master over some area of the world which was considered developing or lesser, where the people, were not yet capable. This is in the minds, of course, of the Western Europeans, not yet capable of self-government. And these mandates were with the intent that the European powers would prepare the indigenous peoples to take over eventually and have their own government, their own self-determination. The British received the mandate for Palestine. Not coincidentally, this is not a random choice. The British were already on the ground there with their armies, so it made sense to do this. Really, the mandates are just an acknowledgement of the status quo for the most part, with, of course, stripping Germany and Austria and the Ottomans of the territory that they had claimed, right? And so, with the establishment of mandatory Palestine, that is, Palestine under a British mandate government, the British begin to, do a couple of things. They're still working with the Hashemites, but at the same time, they create, or they allow for the establishment of this thing called the Jewish Agency, which becomes a kind of quasi-government under the British mandate for Jewish interests in Palestine, right? In response to the Balfour Declaration and to continued Jewish immigration to Palestine, the Arabs become more and more, angry about all of this. There are lots of protests, riots in Palestine, demands that the Balfour Declaration be withdrawn, that it be annulled. And the British are beginning to get frustrated with all of this. They divide up Palestine into, well, zones for continued Jewish habitation and zones for the government of the Hashemites. This is, in fact, Palestine had included this area, which was known as Transjordan, which becomes eventually the nation of Jordan. That was all part of the same governed territory under mandatory Palestine. The Transjordan area is given to the Hashemites, and Hussein becomes king there. But in Cisjordan, or in Levantine Palestine, what of course eventually becomes Palestine-Israel, there is a division even there, where there's the Jewish agency operating, but at the same time, the British appoint a guy named Amin al-Husseini, who is pictured here at the bottom left, as the so-called Mufti, which is a kind of catch-all Muslim religious authority figure, but he becomes the leader of the Arab Palestinian community. And the Mufti of Jerusalem ends up being a rather outspoken, and we might say, well, not might say, definitely say controversial figure. He is ardently anti-Jewish. I think it's safe to say, given his attitudes, his writings, and other things, that he is anti-Semitic. He eventually becomes, and I'll talk about this in a minute here, becomes an outspoken supporter of the Axis powers. He meets at times with Hitler and Himmler and others, right? And so the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, is a controversial figure, but he is the one arguing most vociferously for a Palestine for Arabs, and arguing that the Jews just need to go away, right? That they have no justification for establishing a homeland in the place where his people live. The 1920s sees a renewed migration. There are third and fourth aliyahs there. These are rather short-lived, largely the results of the happenings in places like Poland and now Soviet Russia. But more and more Jews continue to make it there, and it's during this time that we see the establishment of a number of important Jewish institutions. The Haganah, which is a defense organization, and this is closely tied initially with the Mapai Party, which evolves into the Labor Party. But this evolves into the Israeli Defense Force, ultimately, into the Israeli army. Also, this thing called the Histadrut. Let's remember that the leadership of the Jewish community at this point is in the hands of these socialist Russian immigrants like David Ben-Gurion, who's pictured here on the slide. So the Histadrut was a kind of labor union, or a federation of workers, right? A workers' organization. Not surprising given the political makeup of the Jewish leaders there, as well as the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, right, which becomes the kind of flagship educational institution in the state of Israel eventually, right. The Mapai Party evolves into the Labor Party, which dominates politics. They hold all the key positions in the Jewish agency at this point. But there are some who begin to argue that the Jews need to take a more aggressive line in negotiations with the British, in fighting against the Arabs. And so this group is called the Revisionists. They're led initially by a fellow named Vladimir Jabotinsky. And they become the opponents of the Labor Party. They even established, as was common during the time, their own kind of paramilitary organization called the Irgun. Political parties in the 1920s and 30s commonly had paramilitary elements to them. You may know, of course, the Nazis are, not to compare the Jews with the Nazis at all here. That's unintentional, but just as an example of this, the Sturmabteilung, or the SA, is a kind of paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. This is not uncommon for parties to have this. There are political parties in Eastern Europe who have their own kind of military wing, and the Haganah forms this for the Labour Party, and the Irgun forms this for the revisionists. And the Haganah and the Irgun begin to clash with one another at times, as well as with more intent against the Arabs. Arab nationalism kicks into high gear. The Mufti forms this thing called the Arab Higher Committee. And with the creation of the fascist parties in Europe, especially the Nazis, the Mufti begins to meet with them, and he even sends kind of financial support to the Nazis in exchange for promises that he will, be able to govern an acknowledged Palestinian Arab nation once the Nazis have taken over and kind of wipe out the Jews, right? So that those negotiations are ongoing all through the late 1930s and into the war period. The British partition, or they float a partition plan of Palestine, where they claim that we need to share this territory. This is not the last partition. Of course, the UN is going to come back and partition this in the late 1940s. But the British say that the kind of the coastland and Galilee and the Jezreel Valley, which is sort of west and south of Galilee, that will be the Jewish homeland. That the central, sorry again for the yawn, the central hill country and the Negev, which is the whole southern desert part of Palestine, will be given to the Arabs, and that the British will retain control of Jerusalem and Nazareth, in a kind of strip in the middle of Palestine. The revisionists are opposed to this. Labour accepts this somewhat reluctantly, but they're on board with it. And the Mufti and the Arab Higher Committee reject it out of hand. They want nothing to do with any plan that gives the Jews any sort of control of any part of Palestine. The Mufti is arguing that Jews are interlopers, that they have no right to any of the land of Palestine. And we can already see the kind of hard lines taken by people on both sides of this divide that will evolve into the hard lines, that persist all the way to the present. When World War II breaks out, Labour, now somewhat reluctantly, I did not mention the most important part here. In 1939, the British government issues the infamous White Paper. A White Paper was just a kind of official declaration of the British government. That's a technical term, but the White Paper of 1939 is an infamous document where the British really kind of reel back on all of the promises made in the Balfour Declaration. Well, not all of them, but they really scale back their commitment to the Jewish nation. Let's take a look at some features of the 1939 White Paper. This is on the Yale University Law Library website, the Avalon Project, which is a great website, by the way, if you're interested in legal history and the history of diplomacy. This, and I'm not going to go through every part of this document, but the document itself refers to the Balfour Declaration, refers to the command paper of 1922, which was a scaling back itself of the Balfour Declaration, acknowledging that there are also promises made to the Arabs who live there. But the part that really angers the Jews is, and so they the scaling back does say that the Arabs and the Jews should share a government there, that they're that the partition probably isn't going to work, that they need to come up with some kind of shared arrangement. By this point, most people most Jews and most Arabs definitely saw that as impossible. They just wanted the other to go, right? Labor was open to sharing the territory of Palestine, but the Arabs are definitely against that idea, and the revisionists are against that idea. The part that angers everyone, including labor, including the Labor Party, is this part about immigration. The 1939 White Paper limits Jewish immigration, slows it to a trickle. There had been, a fairly steady flow. Well, here it says, for over the next 5 years, a quota of 10,000 Jewish immigrants will be allowed on the understanding that a shortage 1 year may be added to the quotas for subsequent years, and so forth and so on, right? And that refugees may be sent there, because this is 1939, and already there are lots and lots of Jewish refugees from Central Europe, given what's going on there with the Nazis and the Nuremberg laws and things like that, right? But the immigration is going to be severely curtailed here, okay? And that after the period of 5 years, no further Jewish immigration will be permitted, unless, and this is not going to happen at this point, right, unless the Arabs of Palestine are prepared to acquiesce in it, okay? And that the government, Her Majesty's government, will check illegal immigration. So this all has to be done legally. Any Jews who are just trying to sneak into Palestine will be prevented from doing that, as much as Her Majesty's government is able to do that, right? So in addition to that, it limits Jewish purchases of land from Arabs, and creates a whole system where there needs to be an approval process. And this is, anyway, it becomes obvious that the British are going to make it difficult for Jews to obtain land in Palestine. And this all seems to be a betrayal, at least for the Jews, a betrayal of the promises that the British made in the Balfour Declaration and in some subsequent declarations, some subsequent negotiations they had with the Jews. And so they're really upset about this. When the war breaks out, many Jews argue that the British are not worthy of their support. But Ben-Gurion and others acquiesce to this. They know that the British are still probably their best hope for a Western ally. Obviously, the Nazis are not going to be their ally, right? So, they're determined to oppose the Axis. And the Mufti was supporting the Axis, so it makes sense along those lines too, and kind of local lines. And so the Palestinian Jews now form a Jewish brigade, which they send to help to aid in the British war effort. This actually isn't formed until 1944, okay, but they support them militarily in other ways. Some Jews go off and join with the British Army. However, after the British win some victories in North Africa, in the kind of North African Middle Eastern theater, they begin to impose restrictions on the Jews in Palestine obtaining arms. And they come out openly, as a kind of continuation of the 1939 White Paper, openly in opposition against free Jewish immigration there, right? And despite the Jews supporting them in the war. After the war, the British, well, a number of things happen. There are lots of refugee ships taking survivors of the Holocaust via the Mediterranean off to Palestine. These are frequently turned back by the British military, and they set up what amounts to a blockade around Palestine. The most famous of these is the incident on the Exodus, which was a ship containing Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. The British military boarded the ship, and they ended up in a battle on the ship. The Jewish novelist Leon Uris wrote a book about this called simply The Exodus, or Exodus, I believe. Anyway, this is an incident that sticks in the minds of many Israelis. And so the revisionists in particular strike out against the British. A hardline group of revisionists under the leadership of, well, his surname is Stern. I forget what his first name is. I can get this. I want to say Mordecai, but oh, Avraham. That's right. It came to me right as I looked it up on another device here. Avraham Stern. That's the name. That's where the name comes from. And the Stern gang, as it's called colloquially, it's in Hebrew it's called Lehi, with a symbol of two raised fingers. But they begin to carry out assassinations of British government officials in Palestine. This leads to mass arrests of Jews associated with this in 1946. And in response to this mass incarceration, the Irgun, not the Stern gang, and so just the kind of regular revisionist military operation, carries out a bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And that's the picture in the upper right-hand corner of the slide here. The King David Hotel was the administrative headquarters of the British Mandatory Government. And so, this is a direct attack on the British government there. This is met with an international outcry. And much as was happening in other British colonies, the British just become, well, this leads to a kind of doubling down on the blockade. But the British just become so frustrated with this that with the creation of the United Nations, oh, by the way, the King David Hotel, if you were wondering, something like 91, I think, people are killed in that. People of many nations, but this includes a number of British government officials who are killed in the bombing. And as I said, it sparks an international outcry. The British turn over Palestine effectively to the United Nations with the creation of the UN after the war. And the United Nations comes up with a partition plan, and that is pictured here on the slide, okay, where all of the stuff in the teal color here is to be given to the Jews, and everything in the orange color is to be given to the Arabs, with Jerusalem and its suburbs held as a city under direct UN government. In fact, some take to calling this, Jerusalem is going to be an international city, the property of the United Nations. I'm not sure how they thought that was going to work exactly, but the UN is fairly new as an organization and has also all kinds of ideas going on in this period. So this is 1947. This was supported by all of the Security Council, the United States, even the Soviet Union, which tended to veto almost everything in these early days, supports this. But the Palestinian Arabs then do not agree to this at all. The Labor Party is on board with this partition plan, at least initially, but it becomes obvious that both the revisionists and the Arabs are not going to support this, and they are beginning to make kind of military moves to oppose it. The Labor government, David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Idel and others, then go ahead and proclaim the establishment of an independent Jewish state called the State of Israel, and this leads then to the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, which I will talk about in a later lecture. Okay, I know that was a lot of information. Hopefully that was not too confusing. Hopefully that was fairly clear, and we will continue this discussion talking about the State of Israel post-1948, or beginning with the 1948 War of Independence. Our next lecture will talk about the Holocaust, which, of course, is a very dark topic, and so prepare yourselves for that one. Thanks.